The marketplace of Chester, England, 1066, reeked of rotting fish and unwashed bodies. Among the bustling merchants and beggars, 10-year-old Alara spotted something that made her heart stop. A towering woman with intricate braids and scarred hands, desperately offering crude wooden dolls to passing traders. The woman's eyes held the hollow stare of someone who'd lost everything. What Alara didn't know was that this woman was Astrid Ironborn, the sole survivor of the legendary Bloodaxe clan, carrying knowledge of Viking treasure routes worth kingdoms. Astrid had been wandering for months after her longship was destroyed, reduced to carving children's toys to avoid starvation, while Saxon armies hunted her people to extinction. When Alara tugged her father's sleeve and asked those fateful words, she set in motion events that would bring ancient Viking magic into their quiet English village. But Astrid's enemies were already closing in, drawn by whispers of the last Bloodaxe still breathing. Could one family's kindness protect a warrior whose very existence threatened to ignite a war between two worlds? Alara's small fingers wrapped around her father's wool sleeve, pulling with an insistence that made Edmund pause mid-conversation with the grain merchant. He looked down at his daughter's upturned face, those earnest brown eyes that had inherited her mother's gentle nature. "Father," she whispered, though her gaze remained fixed on the strange woman across the crowded square. "Look at her. She's so thin." Edmund followed his daughter's stare and felt his breath catch. The woman was indeed striking, not just for her obvious foreign heritage, but for the way she held herself despite her circumstances. Even hunched over her meager collection of wooden trinkets, there was something regal about her bearing, something that spoke of nobility fallen on hard times. The woman's clothes, though travel-stained and patched, showed quality craftsmanship. Her cloak was fastened with what appeared to be silver, tarnished but real. Most telling were her hands, scarred and calloused in ways that spoke of weapon work rather than common labor. "She's probably dangerous, little sparrow," Edmund murmured, using his pet name for Alara. "Best we keep our distance." But even as he spoke, he watched a portly merchant kick at the woman's wooden dolls, scattering them across the muddy cobblestones. The woman didn't retaliate or even speak. She simply gathered her wares with quiet dignity, though her jaw clenched with barely contained emotion. "No, father." Alara's voice carried that particular tone of stubborn certainty that reminded Edmund so painfully of his late wife. "She's not dangerous. She's hurt. Look how carefully she carved those dolls. See the little faces. Someone dangerous wouldn't take such care with children's toys." Edmund found himself studying the wooden figures more closely. His daughter was right. Despite their crude appearance from a distance, each doll bore intricate details: tiny braided hair, minute facial features, even small carved belts and boots. This was the work of someone who understood children, who had perhaps once carved toys for little ones of her own. The woman suddenly looked up, as if sensing their scrutiny. Her eyes met Edmund's across the marketplace, and he felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, but recognition. This was the look of someone who had lost family, who carried grief like a physical weight. He had worn that same expression for months after his wife's death. "Can we take her home, father?" Alara asked, her voice small but determined. "Just for a meal? Mother always said we should help those who have lost their way." The words struck Edmund like a physical blow. Sarah had indeed taught their daughter that kindness was never wasted, that their small home should always have room for one more at the table. It was a philosophy that had made their marriage rich with unexpected friendships and had filled their cottage with laughter from neighbors and strangers alike. But this was different. These were dangerous times. King Harold's armies were mobilizing, rumors of invasion filled every conversation, and Saxon soldiers had been through Chester only last week, asking questions about Norse refugees. Harboring what was clearly a Viking woman could bring serious consequences. Yet as Edmund watched, the woman's composure finally cracked. Her hands trembled as she arranged her wooden dolls, and he could see her lips moving in what might have been prayer, or simply the muttering of someone pushed beyond endurance. She was someone's daughter, perhaps someone's mother. How could he turn away? "One meal," he heard himself saying, "and a night's shelter, nothing more." Alara's face lit up with joy, and she was already moving toward the woman before Edmund could reconsider. He hurried after her, his heart pounding with equal measures of compassion and trepidation. As they approached, the woman's hand moved instinctively toward her hip, where a weapon would once have hung. The gesture lasted only a moment before her arm fell back to her side, but Edmund had seen it. Whatever else she might be, this woman was indeed a warrior. The question that would haunt him for days to come was whether he was offering shelter to a lost soul in need, or inviting death itself to sit at his family's table. The wooden doll felt warm in Astrid's palm as she hurried through the village streets, her bare feet splashing through puddles left by the morning rain. The carved figure was more intricate than anything she'd seen. Tiny braids etched into the hair, delicate folds in the miniature dress, even small dots for freckles across the wooden cheeks. Whatever else the stranger might be, he was no ordinary craftsman. Her mother stood bent over the cooking fire when Astrid burst through their cottage door, breathless from running. "Mama, look what I traded for the bread!" Ingrid straightened, wiping soot-stained hands on her apron. Her eyes, the same pale blue as her daughter's, widened as she examined the doll. "This is extraordinary work. Who made this?" "A man in the market. He seemed so hungry, Mama." His hands were shaking. Astrid hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I invited him to share our supper." Her mother's face went still. "Astrid, child, you cannot simply—" A shadow fell across their doorway. The stranger stood there, broader somehow in the confined space of their small home, his weathered cloak dripping. Up close, Astrid could see the careful way he held himself, favoring his left side, and the barely healed scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice carrying that same odd accent. "Your daughter showed kindness to a stranger. I would not impose, but—" "No imposition," Ingrid said quickly, though Astrid caught the tremor in her voice. "Please, sit. Astrid, fetch our guest some ale." The man, he'd said his name was Eric, hadn't he, lowered himself carefully onto the wooden stool beside their table. His pale eyes swept the cottage, taking in the herb bundles hanging from the rafters, the neat stack of wool waiting to be spun, the small shrine to the village's patron saint in the corner. When his gaze lingered on the iron cross above their hearth, something flickered across his features too quickly for Astrid to interpret. "You live alone?" he asked, as Astrid set a clay cup before him. "My husband died 2 winters past," Ingrid replied, stirring the pot of barley stew. "The fever took many that year." Eric nodded slowly. "I am sorry for your loss. It is difficult to lose family." Something in his tone made Astrid study his face more carefully. There was grief there, old and deep, etched into the lines around his eyes. She'd seen that same expression in the mirror after her father's death, the look of someone carrying ghosts. "Are you traveling far?" Ingrid asked as she ladled stew into wooden bowls. "As far as the road takes me." Eric accepted his bowl with a slight bow of his head. "I have no fixed destination, running from something then, or toward it." The question hung in the air between them. Eric raised the spoon to his lips, and Astrid saw his hand tremble slightly. Whether from hunger or something else, she couldn't tell. "Both, perhaps," he said finally. They ate in companionable silence for a while. Eric consumed his portion with the focused intensity of someone who had gone too long without proper food, though he was careful not to appear greedy. Astrid found herself stealing glances at him, noting details, the silver arm ring that gleamed beneath his sleeve, the way he instinctively positioned himself with a clear view of the door, the small leather pouch he kept close to his side. "The doll," her mother said eventually. "Where did you learn such carving?" My daughter enjoyed them." Eric's knuckles whitened where they gripped his spoon. "I made them to amuse her during the long winter nights." Astrid's heart clenched. "What happened to her?" "Astrid," her mother warned gently. But Eric was already answering, his voice carefully controlled. "Raiders came to our settlement 2 seasons past. They left nothing standing, no one alive." He set down his spoon, the motion deliberate and slow. "Save for those of us who were hunting in the far hills when the ships arrived." The cottage fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Astrid felt tears prick her eyes, understanding now the weight of sorrow she'd glimpsed in the stranger's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Eric's smile was sad but genuine. "You have a kind heart, little one. Your father raised you well. How did you know?" "The way you speak of him. The way your mother's face softens when his memory surfaces." Eric glanced toward the rafters where a man's hunting bow still hung, gathering dust. "Love like that leaves marks on a place." Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and the first drops of evening rain began to patter against the cottage's single window. Ingrid looked toward the sound, then back at their guest. "The weather grows foul," she said quietly. "You're welcome to shelter here for the night." Eric's hand moved instinctively to his side, to that carefully guarded pouch. For a moment, conflict warred across his features. "Your kindness honors me," he said finally. "But I fear—" Thunder rolled across the valley, cutting off his words, and something shifted in his expression. The wooden doll felt warm in Astrid's palm as she hurried through the narrow streets toward home, her mind churning with questions about the strange warrior. The carved figure was exquisite, far more detailed than anything the local craftsmen produced. Tiny braids were etched into the woman's hair, and her dress bore intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story Astrid couldn't read. She paused at the well in the town square, pretending to adjust her basket while stealing glances back toward the market. The tall stranger had vanished, leaving no trace except the memory of his haunted eyes and the treasure now hidden beneath her bread. "Astrid!" Her younger brother Magnus came running, his face flushed with excitement. "Father's back from the monastery early. He's asking for you." Her stomach tightened. Father rarely returned from his scribing work before evening, and when he did, it usually meant trouble. She quickened her pace through the familiar maze of timber houses, Magnus chattering beside her about some game he'd been playing with wooden swords. Their modest dwelling sat near the edge of town, where cultivated fields gave way to dense forest. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could hear her mother humming inside, a good sign that suggested whatever had brought father home wasn't catastrophic. Harold the scribe stood hunched over his writing desk when they entered, his graying beard nearly touching a piece of parchment covered in careful Latin script. He looked up as Astrid set down her basket, his weathered face creased with concern. "Close the door," he said quietly, "and bolt it." Magnus's chatter died instantly. Their mother, Gunhild, emerged from the kitchen area, wiping her hands on her apron. The smell of barley porridge filled the small space, but no one seemed interested in food. "What's happened?" Gunhild asked, settling on the wooden bench beside the fire. Harold set down his quill with deliberate care. Brother Thomas received word from the coastal settlements. 3 fishing boats found burned and abandoned 2 days' ride north. No survivors. Astrid's hand instinctively moved to her belt, where the wooden doll pressed against her side beneath her cloak. The warrior's face flashed in her memory. Those pale scars, the way he'd moved like a predator, even while weakened by hunger. "Raiders?" Magnus whispered, his eyes wide. "Perhaps." Harold's gaze swept over his family, or something else. The boats weren't looted, nothing taken that they could tell. Just destroyed. Gunhild pulled Magnus closer. "Should we go to your sisters in Hedeby, until whatever this is passes? The roads aren't safe for traveling right now. We stay close to home, keep our doors barred at night, and trust in God's protection." Harold's voice carried the authority of a man who'd survived 40 winters, through caution and wisdom. Astrid nodded along with the others, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The warrior had mentioned being far from home, speaking of distance like a man who'd traveled beyond the reach of normal journeys. And there had been something in his manner, not the swagger of a raider, but the wariness of someone being hunted. After their simple evening meal, she helped her mother clean, while Harold worked on his manuscripts by candlelight. Magnus had fallen asleep by the fire, and the house had settled into its familiar nighttime rhythms. When she was certain no one was watching, Astrid slipped outside to the small garden behind their home. The wooden doll seemed to glow in the moonlight as she examined it more closely. The carved woman's face held an expression of serene strength, and around her neck hung what looked like a tiny hammer pendant. Astrid traced the intricate knotwork patterns on the figure's dress, recognizing some symbols from the old stones that dotted the countryside, remnants of beliefs that had largely given way to the new Christian faith. A twig snapped in the forest beyond their fence. Astrid froze, clutching the doll. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the soft whisper of branches being carefully parted. Someone was moving through the woods with practiced stealth, and they were heading toward the house. She crept toward the fence, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the gaps between the wooden posts, she caught a glimpse of movement, a tall figure picking his way between the trees with predatory grace. It was him, the warrior from the market. For a moment, panic seized her. Had she somehow led danger to her family's door? But as he emerged into a patch of moonlight, she saw no weapons in his hands. Instead, he carried what looked like another wooden carving, larger than the doll, perhaps a bowl or cup. He approached the fence and stopped, his pale eyes finding hers immediately as if he'd known she was there all along. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You showed kindness to a stranger today. I would return it, if you'll permit me. Dark things hunt these woods tonight, and your father is wise to bar his doors." The wooden doll felt warm in Mira's palm as she hurried through the village streets, her heart still racing from the encounter. She clutched her father's coin purse with her free hand, the remaining coppers jingling softly with each step. The stranger's eyes haunted her, blue as winter ice, yet holding depths of pain she couldn't fathom. She paused at the baker's stall, purchasing 2 loaves of dark bread and a wheel of hard cheese with the last of her coins. Old Henrik raised an eyebrow at her purchases. "Feeding an army today, little Mira?" "Just hungry," she mumbled, avoiding his curious gaze. She couldn't explain the compulsion driving her, the need to return to that broken man with something more substantial than scraps. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as she retraced her steps to the alley. She expected to find it empty. Surely he had moved on, continued whatever desperate journey had brought him to their village. But there he sat, exactly as she'd left him, back pressed against the stone wall, the remaining wooden figures scattered before him like fallen soldiers. He looked up as her footsteps approached, and she saw something flicker across his weathered features. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. "You returned." His voice carried an accent she couldn't place, each word carefully measured. Mira nodded, suddenly shy. She set the bread and cheese on the ground between them, close enough for him to reach but far enough to maintain distance. "You looked hungry." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Hungry." He repeated the word as if tasting something foreign. "Yes, I suppose that describes it." She settled onto her heels, studying his face in the better light. Now she could see the silver threads woven through his dark beard, the intricate scars that crisscrossed his forearms like a map of old battles. A leather cord around his neck disappeared beneath his tattered shirt, hiding whatever token he carried close to his heart. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, his hand moving unconsciously to that hidden cord. "Names have power, little one. Are you certain you wish to know mine?" "I told you mine," she pointed out. "Mira." He said it slowly, as if learning the shape of it. "A good name. It means wonderful in the old tongue." "The old tongue?" Again that pause, heavy with unspoken histories. "My name is Bjorn." He reached for the bread, tearing off a piece with trembling fingers. Bjorn Eriksson, last son of the Iron Wolves. The name meant nothing to Mira, but the way he spoke it, like a funeral dirge, made her shiver. "Where are you from?" "A place that no longer exists." He chewed slowly, savoring each bite. "My people. We were warriors once, proud, strong. We sailed the whale roads and carved our names into legend." His eyes grew distant. "But legends die, little Mira. Sometimes they die screaming." She watched him eat, noting how he portioned the food carefully, making it last. Everything about him spoke of discipline earned through hardship, the way he sat despite obvious pain, the careful attention he paid to his surroundings, the methodical manner in which he gathered his scattered dolls. "These are beautiful," she said, lifting one of the figures. It was a woman with long braided hair, her face serene despite the warrior's garb carved into the wood. "Did you make them?" "My daughter's likeness," he said quietly. "I carved it from memory. The wood is birch from the sacred grove where she was born. Where is she now?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Bjorn's hands stilled on the bread, and for a moment Mira thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Gone. They are all gone." The weight of his grief settled over them both, heavy as storm clouds. Mira wanted to ask more, to understand the tragedy that had reduced this proud man to begging in alleys, but something in his expression warned her away from that path. Instead, she asked, "Will you stay in our village?" Bjorn shook his head. "I cannot linger anywhere long. My enemies have long memories and longer reach. To stay would bring danger to innocent people." His ice-blue eyes fixed on hers. "To you, what enemies?" "The kind that turn children into orphans and villages into ash." He stood slowly, wincing as his body protested the movement. "Your kindness honors you, Mira Wonderful, but kindness can be a dangerous gift. Some men are too broken to be saved." He gathered his dolls, wrapping them carefully in a piece of worn cloth. The food disappeared into a leather pouch at his belt. "Wait!" Mira called as he turned to leave. She held up the doll he'd given her. "You forgot this." Bjorn looked back, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched his lips. "That one is yours now. Guard it well. It carries more than you know." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, disappearing into the maze of village streets like mist before the morning sun. The wooden doll felt different in Elena's hands the next morning, its carved features somehow more alive in the pale dawn light filtering through her bedchamber window. She traced the intricate braided hair with her fingertip, marveling at the craftsmanship. Each strand was no thicker than a thread, yet perfectly defined. "Elena? Child? Come help with the morning bread." Her mother's voice drifted up from below. She tucked the doll beneath her pillow and hurried downstairs, her mind still occupied with thoughts of the strange man from the market. Throughout the morning's chores, kneading dough, collecting eggs, sweeping the hearth, she found herself glancing toward the door, wondering if he would return to his corner today. Her father emerged from the back room where he kept his cobbler's tools, leather apron already tied around his waist. "The alderman's boots need mending before evening," he announced, settling onto his work stool. "That man has feet like bear paws." "Perhaps because he has the appetite of one as well," her mother replied with a knowing smile. "Did you see him at the harvest feast? I swear he ate enough for 3 men." Elena only half listened to their familiar banter. When her mother handed her a basket and asked her to fetch turnips from the market, her heart quickened. She tried to keep her expression neutral as she accepted the task. The morning market bustled with its usual energy, but Elena's eyes went immediately to the corner where she had seen the stranger. Empty. Disappointment settled in her chest like a stone. She moved through the stalls mechanically, selecting the best turnips while scanning the crowd. "Looking for someone, dear?" Old Henrik, the turnip seller, followed her gaze. "The man who was here yesterday," she said carefully. "He was selling wooden dolls." Henrik's weathered face darkened. I saw him. Strange fellow, that one. Speaking in tongues, he was. Father Marcus says we should be wary of strangers, especially those who don't worship as we do." Elena's grip tightened on her basket. He seemed harmless enough. "Harmless?" Henrik lowered his voice. "My boy Johann heard him muttering in the old language. Viking words, like as not. Could be a scout marking our town for raiders." The accusation hit Elena like cold water. She had heard the stories, tales of longships appearing without warning, of villages burned and people taken. But the man she had seen looked barely capable of standing, let alone leading raids. She paid for her turnips and was turning to leave when she spotted a familiar figure near the baker's stall. Not the Viking man, but Johann, Henrik's son, along with 2 other young men she recognized. They were speaking in hushed, urgent tones, their faces animated with the kind of excitement that usually meant trouble. "Seen him by the old mill this morning," Johann was saying. "Just sitting there, staring at the water like he was planning something." "We should tell the alderman," suggested Willem, the blacksmith's apprentice. Or we could handle it ourselves, said the third, Marcus, the priest's nephew. His hand rested on the knife at his belt. Drive him off before he can cause harm. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She thought of the man's hollow eyes, the careful way he had counted his meager coins. Whatever he was, she couldn't believe he posed a threat to anyone. Without fully deciding to do so, she found herself walking toward the mill. The old stone building sat beside the stream that powered its great wheel, abandoned since the new mill had been built closer to town. Tall grass and wildflowers had reclaimed much of the area, creating a secluded spot that few people visited. She found him sitting on a fallen log beside the water, just as Johann had described. Up close, in the clear morning light, she could see details that had escaped her notice in the market's chaos. His clothes, though worn and patched, showed signs of fine craftsmanship. The cloak draped over his shoulders was held by a bronze brooch worked with intricate patterns. Most telling of all, she noticed the way his right hand rested protectively over something at his side. Not a weapon, but what appeared to be a leather pouch. He looked up as she approached, wariness flickering across his features. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the gentle murmur of the stream and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields beyond. "You bought doll yesterday," he said finally, his accent thick but his words carefully chosen. "Was good?" Elena nodded, unsure why she had come or what she intended to say. "Very beautiful. You're quite skilled." Something that might have been surprise crossed his face, followed by what looked almost like pain. He turned back to the water, and she noticed his shoulders trembling slightly, whether from cold, hunger, or something else, she couldn't tell. "You're in danger," she said suddenly. "There are men in town who mean you harm." The morning mist clung to the harbor like ghostly fingers, obscuring the horizon where Astrid knew ships might emerge. She had woken before dawn, drawn by restless dreams of longboats cutting through dark waters, their dragon prows gleaming with malevolent eyes. Magnus had been unusually quiet during their evening meal, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he carved another tiny figure from driftwood. She found him already awake in the small alcove where he slept, sitting cross-legged with his back against the stone wall. His eyes held a distant quality, as if he were seeing not her humble cottage but vast halls filled with the echoes of forgotten voices. "They are coming," he said without preamble, his accent thick with old memories. "I can feel it in my bones, like the change of seasons." Astrid settled beside him, noting how the carved wooden figures seemed to watch them from their perch on the narrow shelf. Each face bore the same haunted expression she now recognized in Magnus himself. "Who is coming?" "The Bloodaxe clan." He spoke the name like a curse, his fingers unconsciously moving to the faded scar that ran along his forearm. "They have hunted my people across 3 seas, through winter storms that would break lesser men. We were rivals once, then enemies, and finally—" He paused, searching for words that could encompass such devastation. "Finally, we became their obsession." The cottage felt smaller suddenly, its walls no longer a comfort but a trap. Astrid pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What did your clan do to earn such hatred?" Magnus's laugh held no warmth. "We existed. We thrived. We held secrets they coveted." He reached for one of his carvings, a warrior woman with intricate braids. "My grandmother could read the old runes, the ones that spoke of hidden places where the earth itself held power. My father knew the location of 3 burial mounds that contained enough silver to buy a kingdom. But most dangerous of all, we remembered the blood-binding rituals that could make a man's oath unbreakable." Astrid had heard whispers of such things in the market, old women crossing themselves when certain names were mentioned. "Magic?" "Power," Magnus corrected. "The kind that comes from understanding what the earth remembers and what the dead refuse to forget. The Bloodaxe clan sought to claim these secrets for themselves. When we refused to share them—" He set the carving down with careful deliberation. "They began killing us one by one." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters with increasing urgency. Astrid thought of her peaceful village, the fishermen mending their nets, children playing in narrow streets. The idea that such violence could reach them seemed impossible, yet she could see in Magnus's eyes that impossibility meant nothing to determined enemies. "How many are left?" she asked. "Of my clan, I am the last." The words fell between them like stones dropped in deep water. "Of theirs? Too many. Eric Bloodaxe leads them now, my cousin by marriage and my greatest enemy. He believes that if he spills my blood in the proper ceremony, the secrets will transfer to him. He does not understand that knowledge dies with its keeper when taken by force." Astrid stood and moved to the small window, peering through gaps in the wooden shutters. The harbor remained empty, but she could not shake the feeling of being watched. "Why did you stop running? Why risk staying in one place?" Magnus rose and joined her at the window, his presence both comforting and terrifying. "Because I am tired, child. Tired of sleeping with one eye open, tired of never knowing friendship or kindness without calculating its cost. When you offered me food that first day, asking nothing in return," he trailed off, then continued more quietly, "I had forgotten that such goodness existed in the world." The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. Astrid understood now why he had seemed so startled by simple kindness, why he watched her as if she might vanish like morning fog. But she also understood that her compassion had inadvertently painted a target on their small village. "What do we do?" The question came out smaller than she intended. Magnus turned from the window, his expression hardening into something that reminded her he had once been a warrior feared across northern seas. "We prepare. I will not run again, but neither will I lead them to slaughter innocents. There is a place, an old stone circle in the hills beyond the village. If they come, I will meet them there." "Alone?" "As I have always been alone." He picked up his carving tools and the half-finished figure he had been working on. "But first, there is something you must know. Something I should have told you from the beginning about what it truly means to shelter the last son of the Stormwolf clan." The morning light filtered through the small window of Astrid's cottage, casting dancing shadows across the wooden floor, where Magnus sat carefully whittling another doll. His massive hands moved with surprising delicacy as he shaped the tiny figure, each stroke of his knife deliberate and precise. Astrid watched from the doorway, fascinated by the contradiction between his warrior's build and the gentle artistry of his work. "The market folks speak differently when they see you now," she observed, settling beside him with 2 bowls of warm porridge. "Yesterday, old Henrik actually smiled." Magnus paused in his carving, considering her words. In the week since arriving at her cottage, he had indeed noticed the gradual shift in how the villagers regarded him. Where once there had been suspicion and barely concealed fear, now there was cautious acceptance. Children who had once hidden behind their mother's skirts now approached his market stall with curious eyes, drawn to his intricate wooden creations. "Your people are generous," he said finally, the Norse words still heavy on his tongue despite his improving grasp of the local dialect. "They judge by actions, not by blood." Astrid stirred her porridge thoughtfully. "Father Dunstan says all souls are equal before God, though I think you proved your worth long before any of us remembered that lesson." The mention of the priest brought a shadow to Magnus's expression. Father Dunstan had been instrumental in his acceptance by the community, but Magnus sensed the holy man harbored deeper suspicions than the others. There were questions in the priest's eyes that went beyond simple cultural differences, questions that struck uncomfortably close to truths Magnus preferred to keep buried. A sharp knock at the cottage door interrupted his brooding. Astrid rose to answer it, revealing young Willem, the baker's son, his face flushed from running. "Astrid," the boy gasped. Strangers approached from the north road, armed men on horseback. "Father Dunstan requests you bring the Viking to the church immediately." Magnus was already moving, his warrior instincts awakening like flames catching dry kindling. He recognized the careful neutrality in Willem's tone, the way the boy avoided meeting his eyes directly. This was not a simple request for his presence, it was a warning. "How many?" Magnus asked, his hand unconsciously moving to where his sword would once have hung. 6, perhaps 7. They wear mail and carry shields marked with a raven's head. The blood drained from Magnus's face. The raven's head, Olaf Grimson's banner. Somehow, impossibly, his past had found him even in this peaceful corner of the world. Astrid noticed his reaction immediately. You know these men? They serve someone who believes I possess something that belongs to him. Magnus's voice was carefully controlled, but Astrid could hear the steel beneath it. Something worth more than my life to obtain. Without hesitation, Astrid moved to the small chest beside her bed, retrieving a worn leather pouch. Then, we must ensure they don't find it, she said with startling matter-of-factness. Whatever game we're playing now, you're not playing it alone. Magnus stared at her, struck by the quiet courage in her voice. In his world, loyalty was bought with gold or forged through blood oaths. Here was someone offering both freely, asking nothing in return save honesty. The price of standing with me may be higher than you understand, he warned. The price of abandoning a friend is always higher than we understand, she replied, shouldering a small pack. Now, what exactly are we protecting? Magnus hesitated, then pulled aside his tunic to reveal the leather cord around his neck. Suspended from it was a small, intricately carved runestone, its surface covered with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. The location of my clan's greatest treasure, he admitted. Gold and silver enough to buy a kingdom, hidden where only the last of our bloodline might find it. Olaf Grimson murdered my kinsmen for this knowledge, but the secret died with them, save for what they carved here. Astrid studied the stone with wonder and growing understanding. That's why you carve so skillfully. You've been practicing the old symbols, keeping the memory alive. And now that memory may cost more lives than it's worth. The distant sound of hoofbeats carried on the morning air, growing steadily closer. Willem had already departed to spread word through the village, and Magnus could imagine the hurried conversations now taking place behind closed doors. Would these people who had shown him kindness now pay for their compassion? There's still time for you to claim ignorance, Magnus offered one final time. Tell them I threatened you, forced your charity. They would believe it. Astrid's response was to take his carved hand in her own smaller one, her grip surprisingly strong. My father once told me that we choose who we are in the moments when no one would blame us for choosing otherwise. She met his eyes steadily. I choose to trust the man who carves dolls for children, not the stranger those riders seek. Together, they stepped out into the morning light, walking toward whatever judgment awaited them both. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Astrid hurried toward the baker's stall, her mother's coin purse tucked safely beneath her cloak. She had convinced her parents to let her venture out early, claiming she wanted the freshest loaves before the day's crowd arrived. In truth, she hoped to find Bjorn again, though she dared not speak this intention aloud. The wooden doll he had carved for her sat hidden beneath her mattress, a secret treasure she examined each night by candlelight. The intricate knotwork pattern seemed to shift and dance in the flickering flame, telling stories her young mind could barely grasp yet somehow understood in her bones. As she rounded the corner past the blacksmith's forge, already alive with the ring of hammer on anvil, she spotted a familiar figure hunched against the stone wall of the church. Bjorn sat motionless, his massive frame somehow diminished in the growing daylight. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. "You're hurt," she whispered, approaching cautiously. Up close, she could see the fever-bright gleam in his pale blue eyes and the way his hands trembled as they clutched another of his carved figures. Bjorn's head lifted slowly, as if the simple motion required tremendous effort. When he recognized her, something like relief flickered across his weathered features. "Little Raven," he murmured in his accented Norse. "You should not be here. It is not safe. What happened to you?" Astrid knelt beside him, ignoring the suspicious glances from early market-goers. "Are you sick?" He attempted a smile that became more of a grimace. Old wounds have a way of remembering themselves. The body grows weary of carrying so much weight. His fingers traced the wooden figure absently, this one depicting a great ship with a carved dragon's head, its details so precise she could see individual scales. "My father knows about healing," she offered quickly. "He could—" "No." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch. Bjorn's expression softened immediately. "Forgive me, child, but your father, he would not understand what I am, what I carry." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the narrow street. Bjorn's entire body went rigid, his hand moving instinctively to where a weapon might once have hung at his side. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, their dark cloaks bearing an unfamiliar crest, a twisted tree with ravens in its branches. "Find somewhere else to be, little one," Bjorn whispered urgently, struggling to his feet. "Now." But Astrid found herself frozen as the lead rider dismounted, his boots striking the cobblestones with deliberate authority. He was younger than Bjorn, perhaps her father's age, with the same pale northern features but eyes like winter ice. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command. "Bjorn Ironwolf. The last of the Ravenclaw clan shows himself at last." Bjorn straightened despite his obvious pain, and suddenly Astrid could see the warrior he must once have been. "Valdric Blacktree, still doing your father's hunting, I see." "My father is dead," Valdric replied coldly. "As are yours, as are all who once called themselves your brothers. You are the only thread left uncut, and you have come to remedy that oversight. I have come to collect what you stole. The location of the serpent's hoard dies with your bloodline, as it should have years ago." Astrid pressed herself against the church wall, her heart hammering as she began to understand she was witnessing something far more dangerous than a chance encounter. The wooden doll in Bjorn's hands seemed to pulse with significance she couldn't grasp. "I have nothing left to steal," Bjorn said quietly. "Look at me, Valdric. I am already dead, just too stubborn to lie down. Yet you carve still." Valdric's gaze fell upon the ship figure. "Your grandfather's mark, your clan's secret rendered in wood for any fool to read, if they knew the old ways." Understanding crashed over Astrid like cold water. The intricate patterns, the careful details, they weren't merely decorative. They were a code, a map, a message hidden in plain sight. How many of Bjorn's carvings had he already sold throughout the village? "The girl," Valdric said suddenly, his attention shifting to where Astrid cowered. "She has seen the tokens. She knows your face." "She knows nothing," Bjorn said quickly, stepping protectively between them. "She is innocent of all this. Innocence is a luxury we cannot afford. The Ravenclaw secrets die completely, or they do not die at all." Bjorn's hand closed around the wooden ship so tightly his knuckles went white. "Then you will have to go through me first." Valdric smiled, cold and sharp as a blade. "Old wolf, that was always the plan." The morning air grew thick with tension as the 2 remaining riders dismounted, their hands moving to their weapons. Astrid realized with growing terror that she was about to witness either a murder or a battle, and in either case, her own life hung in the balance of ancient hatreds she could never have imagined. The storm that had threatened for days finally broke just after dawn, sending sheets of rain against the cottage walls with enough force to wake even the deepest sleeper. Astrid pressed her face to the shuttered window, watching water cascade from the thatched roof in heavy streams. The timing couldn't have been worse. "We'll have to postpone the market," her father announced, settling heavily into his chair by the fire. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his breathing carried that rattling quality that always preceded his worst spells. No sense risking the roads in this weather. Eric looked up from where he'd been carving another doll, his knife pausing mid-stroke. The disappointment that flickered across his features was quickly masked, but Astrid caught it. They'd spent the previous evening discussing which pieces to bring, how to arrange them for the best display. More importantly, they needed the coin those dolls would bring. "Perhaps it will clear by midday," Astrid offered hopefully, though the pewter sky showed no signs of mercy. Her mother shook her head while kneading tomorrow's bread. "This storm has the look of one that means to stay. Best we make ourselves comfortable and wait it out." As if summoned by her words, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cottage, followed immediately by a flash of lightning that turned the world briefly white. In that instant, Astrid thought she glimpsed movement in the tree line beyond their garden, a shadow that didn't belong to wind-tossed branches. Eric was on his feet before the thunder faded, his hand instinctively moving to where his sword would have hung. The carved doll clattered to the floor, forgotten. "What is it?" Astrid's father asked, noting the sudden tension. "Probably nothing," Eirik replied, but his eyes remained fixed on the window. "The storm plays tricks with shadows." Yet Astrid noticed how he positioned himself between her family and the door, and how his fingers drummed against his thigh in what she'd learned was his way of thinking through defensive strategies. She moved closer to the window, trying to peer through the gaps in the shutters. "Astrid, come away from there," her mother called sharply. "No good comes from staring into storms." But something cold had settled in Astrid's stomach, a feeling that had nothing to do with the weather. She'd grown to read Eirik's moods over the past weeks, and this wasn't mere caution. This was the alertness of a man who'd spent too many years watching for death to mistake a harmless shadow for the genuine threat. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eirik carved with mechanical precision, producing doll after doll while his attention remained divided between his work and the storm outside. Every sound, the creak of settling timbers, the scratch of branches against the roof, the drumming of rain, seemed to pull his focus toward potential danger. "You're making us all nervous with your pacing," Astrid's mother finally said, though her tone was gentle. "Whatever you're worried about, it can't reach us through this weather." Eirik paused in his carving, considering her words. "You're right, of course. Forgive me. Old habits." But when Astrid brought him ale later in the evening, she found his hands shaking slightly. Not from cold or illness, but from something deeper, a tension wound so tight it threatened to snap. "Tell me," she whispered, settling beside him on the bench. For a long moment, he said nothing. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside the cottage felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in. "There are signs," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Broken branches arranged in patterns that look natural unless you know what to seek. Scratches on tree bark that could be from deer but aren't. Small things that mean nothing to most people. But not to you. Not to someone who learned to read such messages as a child." His knife moved in steady strokes, shaping another doll. "My people. We had ways of marking territory, of leaving warnings, of calling for blood payment." The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Astrid felt her world tilt slightly, the safe familiarity of the cottage suddenly seeming fragile as spun glass. "How long do we have?" she asked. The question surprised them both. Not whether danger was coming, but when. Somehow, in the space between one carved shaving and the next, they'd both accepted the inevitability of it. "The storm will keep them at bay tonight," Eirik said. "Beyond that—" He shrugged, but his grip on the carving knife tightened. "I should leave. Draw them away from you." "No." The word came out sharper than Astrid intended. Her parents looked up from their evening tasks, concern creasing their faces. "Everything well, daughter?" her father asked. "Of course," she replied, forcing brightness into her voice. "Just discussing tomorrow's plans." But under the table, her hand found Eirik's wrist and held tight, as if she could anchor him to safety through will alone. The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud when Astrid first spotted them. 3 figures on horseback emerged from the tree line, their dark silhouettes moving with predatory purpose across the meadow. She pressed herself against the cold stone of the well, heart hammering as she recognized the distinctive profile of curved helmets and battle-worn leather. Eirik's kinsmen had found them. Inside the cottage, she could hear the gentle scraping of Eirik's carving knife against wood, the rhythmic sound that had become as familiar as her own breathing over the past weeks. He was making another doll, this one for little Margot down the lane whose fever had finally broken. The irony struck her like a physical blow. Here was a man who had once wielded weapons of war, now crafting toys with the same calloused hands, and death was riding toward their door. "Eirik," she whispered urgently as she slipped inside, her voice barely audible above the crackling hearth fire. "They've come." His hands stilled instantly. The half-formed doll remained suspended in his grip as his pale eyes met hers, and she saw something flicker across his features. Not fear, but a weary resignation that made her stomach clench. "How many?" His voice carried the weight of inevitability. 3. Maybe more beyond the ridge. Astrid moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the rough woolen curtain. They're scouting the village. Eric set down the doll with deliberate care, as if this simple gesture could preserve some fragment of the peace they'd built together. When he stood, Astrid glimpsed the warrior he must have once been. Shoulders squaring, spine straightening, that quiet intensity returning to his bearing like armor sliding back into place. Your father. Where is he? Market day. Won't return until evening. The words tumbled out as panic began to set in. Eric, we have to run. There's a cave system in the North Hills. My brother and I used to... No. His hand found her shoulder, steadying. Running will only delay this. They've tracked me across half the known world, Astrid. They won't stop until they have what they came for. What they came for? Confusion mingled with her terror. It's revenge they want, isn't it? For whatever happened to your clan? Eric's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his fingers moved to the leather cord around his neck, drawing forth something she'd never seen before, a small silver pendant carved with intricate runes that seemed to writhe in the firelight. They think I carry the secret of Jormunheim's treasure, he said quietly. Gold and silver beyond counting, hidden before my clan's final battle. But the truth is far more dangerous than mere wealth. Astrid stared at the pendant, its surface catching the light like trapped starfire. What truth? The location of the last Divergar forge. The words fell between them like stones into still water, where the ancient ones crafted blades that could cleave through any armor, shields that could turn aside any blow, weapons that could shift the balance of power across all the northern kingdoms. The implications crashed over her in waves. No wonder they'd hunted him so relentlessly. No wonder he'd been reduced to trading wooden dolls for scraps. He carried knowledge that kings would kill for. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew closer. But you won't tell them, she said, and it wasn't a question. The forge was sealed for good reason. Some knowledge is too dangerous to survive. Eric tucked the pendant back beneath his shirt and moved toward the door. The last guardian of my clan swore an oath, and I mean to honor it. Then we fight. Astrid surprised herself with the fierceness in her voice. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the hearth, its weight solid and reassuring in her grip. This is my home. You're under my family's protection. For the first time since she'd known him, Eric smiled. Not the gentle expression she'd grown accustomed to, but something sharp and wild that reminded her he'd survived when his entire clan had fallen. Your courage shames me, little sister, he said, using the pet name her brother had favored. But this is not your war to fight. It became my war the moment I chose to help you. She moved to stand beside him, poker raised. Besides, you think I'd let them destroy our kitchen after all the work we've put into it? The hoofbeats stopped directly outside. Through the window, Astrid could see the lead rider dismounting, a tall man with braided hair and scars crisscrossing his face like a map of old battles. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of command. Eric Bloodraven, last son of Jormunheim. We know you shelter here. Come out, and the girl lives. Hide, and we burn this place to ash with both of you inside. Eric's hand found the door latch, but Astrid caught his wrist. Together, she whispered fiercely. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The morning brought unwelcome visitors. Marta was grinding barley when she heard the horses. Too many horses for ordinary travelers. Through the small window, she glimpsed mail glinting in the early light and felt her blood turn cold. Norman soldiers, at least a dozen of them, their destriers snorting steam in the crisp air. Bjorn, she whispered urgently toward the back room where he still slept. Norman patrol. He was on his feet instantly, moving with that uncanny silence she'd grown accustomed to. His hand went automatically to where his sword would have hung, finding only empty air. The frustration that flickered across his face was quickly replaced by grim calculation. The root cellar, Marta said, already moving toward the concealed entrance beneath their kitchen floor, but Bjorn caught her arm. No, if they search thoroughly, they'll find it, and you'll be guilty of harboring an enemy. His voice was steady, but she could see the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. I'll go into the forest. Tell them you know nothing of Vikings. You can't, Your leg isn't fully healed. In this cold, tracking through snow, I've survived worse." The sound of boots on frozen ground grew closer. Bjorn pressed something into her palm, a small carved raven, no bigger than her thumb. His work, she realized, whittled during the long evenings by firelight. "For luck," he said simply, then moved toward the back door with surprising speed despite his limp. Marta barely had time to slip the carving into her apron pocket before the heavy knock came. She forced herself to count 3 breaths before opening the door, schooling her features into the wary politeness of a peasant woman facing armed men. The leader was young for his rank, with pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. "Good morning, woman. I am Sir Geoffrey of Rouen. We're hunting raiders who've been harassing settlements to the north." "Raiders, my lord?" Marta kept her voice carefully neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Vikings. A small band, we think, perhaps survivors from the summer's battles." His gaze swept past her into the cottage's dim interior. "Have you seen anything unusual? Strangers passing through? Signs of camps in the forest?" "No, my lord. We see few travelers this far from the main road, especially in winter." The lie came easier than she'd expected. Is there danger?" Sir Geoffrey's expression softened slightly at her apparent fear. "Not immediate danger, good woman. We believe most of the band is dead or fled. But one may remain in the area, a large man, likely wounded. He's considered extremely dangerous." Behind the Norman leader, another soldier shifted impatiently. "Sir Geoffrey, we should search the premises. Orders were clear." "Peace, Willem." The young knight's tone carried authority despite his youth. "Will not terrorize honest folk without cause." But his eyes found Marta's again. "You live alone here?" "My father died last harvest, my lord. I manage as I can." Another lie, but close enough to truth that it rang sincere. "And you've noticed nothing strange? No missing livestock, disturbed stores, signs of anyone taking shelter in outbuildings?" Marta forced herself to consider the question as an innocent woman would. "The old mill downstream has a hole in its roof from the autumn storms. Sometimes travelers shelter there. But I haven't been down that way in weeks. Too dangerous for a woman alone." It was a calculated misdirection. The mill was real enough and abandoned, but lay in the opposite direction from where Bjorn would be heading. Sir Geoffrey nodded slowly. "We'll investigate. My thanks for the information." He turned to leave, then paused. "A word of advice, keep your doors barred after dark. Vikings are cunning, and this one has evaded capture for months. He may seem harmless, even pitiful, but he's killed trained soldiers." The soldiers wheeled their horses and rode toward the river path. Marta watched until they disappeared beyond the trees, then sank against her doorframe, legs suddenly weak. Hours passed before she dared venture into the forest. She found Bjorn's tracks easily enough. He'd made no attempt to hide them initially, focused on speed over stealth. But a quarter-mile from the cottage, the trail became more sophisticated, incorporating techniques she couldn't even identify. Following became impossible, but she pressed on, hoping. Near a frozen stream, she called his name softly. Only wind answered. By evening, she'd returned empty-handed, worry gnawing at her stomach. The cottage felt cavernously empty without his quiet presence. She found herself listening for sounds that wouldn't come, starting at every creak of settling timber. As darkness fell, she lit a single candle and placed it in the window, a beacon should he be watching from the tree line. Then she sat by the dying fire, the small wooden raven clutched in her palm, and wondered if kindness to strangers always demanded such a price. The wind picked up outside, howling through the eaves like the voices of the restless dead. The morning brought news that chilled Emma to her bones. Father burst through the cottage door, his face grave as thunderclouds, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to Mother about ships spotted on the horizon. Long ships with carved dragon heads cutting through the gray waters like harbingers of death. Emma's blood turned to ice. She glanced toward the barn where Eric was recovering, his wounds still tender, his strength slowly returning. The timing couldn't be worse. "How many?" Mother whispered, her knuckles white as she gripped her shawl. 3 ships, maybe 4. The watchtower lit the beacon at dawn. Father's voice carried the weight of every villager's fear. They're moving north along the coast, but raiders didn't always stay their course. Emma had heard the stories. Villages burned, families scattered like leaves in an autumn gale. Her stomach twisted as she thought of Eric trapped in their barn, too weak to flee, too proud to hide. She slipped outside while her parents continued their worried conference. The barn stood quiet in the morning mist, and for a terrifying moment she wondered if Eric had already heard the news and vanished like smoke. But when she pushed open the heavy door, she found him sitting on a hay bale, carefully working on another wooden figure. "You heard," she said. It wasn't a question. His hands stilled on the carving. "Aye. Your father has a voice that carries when he's frightened." "They might not come here," Emma said quickly. "They might pass us by entirely." Eric's laugh held no humor. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they follow the same wind that brought me to these shores." He set down his knife and studied the half-formed figure in his palm. "There are things about my past I haven't told you, little one. Dark things that have a way of finding me." Before Emma could ask what he meant, shouting erupted from the village center. They both froze, listening to the distant clamor of voices raised in alarm. Eric rose slowly, testing his balance, and moved to peer through a gap in the barn wall. "What do you see?" Emma whispered. "Riders. Coming fast from the east." His jaw tightened. "They bear the raven banner." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs. She had never seen that particular standard, but the fear in Eric's voice told her everything she needed to know. These weren't mere raiders seeking easy plunder. They were hunting something specific. "You have to run," she said urgently. "Now, while there's still time." Eric shook his head. "I'm done running, child. I've been running for 3 years, and it has brought nothing but death to those who showed me kindness." He turned to face her, and she saw something hard and resolved in his weathered features. "The sins of my past have finally caught up with me." "What sins?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. For a long moment, Eric was silent. Then he reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made Emma's breath catch. A small silver pendant shaped like a hammer, its surface etched with intricate runes that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "I was not always a simple craftsman," he said quietly. "Once, I bore the sacred trust of my clan. This pendant holds secrets that certain men would kill for, secrets about the old ways, the old gods, the hidden places where our people once gathered in strength." Emma stared at the pendant, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "They're not just raiders. They're looking for you. Aye, for me, and for this." He closed his fingers around the silver hammer. "I thought if I disappeared, if I became nothing more than a beggar trading toys for bread, they would give up the hunt. But the blood of the old clans runs deep, and vengeance has a long memory." The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of mail and weapons. Emma's mind raced, searching for solutions, for some way to save the man who had carved her 1,000 small wonders. "The root cellar," she said suddenly. "Behind our cottage. It's hidden under the woodpile. They'd never think to look there." Eric smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, it reached his eyes. "You have the heart of a warrior, little Emma, but I won't bring this curse down on your family. I've seen what these men do to those who aid me. And I've seen what kindness can do," she shot back, surprising herself with her boldness. "You're not the same man who came here starving and broken. You're stronger now. We made you stronger. Don't waste that by throwing your life away." The riders were at the village edge now. Soon they would begin searching every building, every shadow. Eric looked at the pendant in his palm one last time, then pressed it into Emma's hands. "If I don't survive this day," he said softly, "take this to the stone circle on Raven's Hill when the moon is dark. Someone will come for it, someone who understands its true worth." The morning mist clung to the village like a shroud as Astrid helped Magnus secure the last of their meager supplies to his back. Her fingers trembled as she tied the leather straps, not from the cold, but from the weight of what was about to happen. In 3 days, Jarl Grimvar's ships would reach their shores, and Magnus would no longer be the gentle craftsman who carved dolls by her father's hearth. The cave system beyond Raven's Peak. Magnus murmured, his voice barely audible over the distant crash of waves. Your people know it well? Father nodded grimly. Aye, we've sheltered there during the worst storms. It runs deep into the mountain, deeper than most dare to venture. He paused, studying the Viking's weathered face. But feeding 40 souls in those tunnels for weeks. Better hungry than dead, Magnus replied, though Astrid caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. She had seen that same expression when he worked on a particularly intricate carving, weighing each cut of the knife against the risk of ruining the entire piece. The village stirred around them in the pre-dawn darkness. Families emerged from their homes like ghosts, children clutching hastily sewn bundles, mothers carrying infants wrapped in every scrap of warm cloth they could spare. Old Henrik hobbled past, his gnarled hands gripping a walking stick Magnus had carved for him just days before, back when their greatest worry was whether the autumn harvest would last through winter. I still say we should stand and fight, muttered Bjorn, Father's younger brother, as he approached their small group. His hand rested on the hilt of his fishing knife, a pitiful weapon against seasoned raiders. This is our home. Our ancestors' bones rest in this soil. Magnus turned to face him, and for a moment, Astrid saw something ancient and terrible flicker behind his usually kind eyes. Your ancestors' bones will have company soon enough if you choose that path, he said quietly. Grimvar's warriors have been killing since before they could properly hold a sword. They've burned villages from here to the eastern kingdoms. Courage is admirable, but it won't stop an axe from splitting your skull. The harsh words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Several villagers who had gathered nearby shifted uncomfortably, and Astrid noticed how they looked at Magnus now. Not as the harmless stranger who had shared their bread and told stories by the fire, but as what he truly was, a weapon forged in the same brutal world as their approaching enemies. The first group leaves now, Father announced, his voice carrying the authority that had guided their village through countless hardships. Women with small children, the elderly, anyone who cannot move quickly. Follow the old hunting trail to the base of Raven's Peak. Make no fires, leave no tracks. As the villagers began to separate into groups, Astrid felt Magnus's hand settle gently on her shoulder. You should go with the first group, he said. If something goes wrong... No. The word came out sharper than she intended. I know these paths better than anyone. I know which roots are safe to eat, where the freshwater springs are hidden. You'll need that knowledge if... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that their desperate plan might fail. Magnus studied her face in the growing light, and she saw him weighing her words against the danger ahead. Finally, he nodded. Stay close to me, then. When the fighting begins, you run. No matter what happens to anyone else, you run and don't look back. The thought of abandoning him made her stomach twist, but she nodded anyway. She understood now why her mother had cried the night her older brother left to seek his fortune in distant lands. Some promises were made to be broken when love demanded it. As the first group of villagers disappeared into the morning mist, Magnus walked to the edge of the village, where the ground rose toward the ancient stone markers that had stood since before anyone could remember. He knelt there, pressing his palm against the cold earth, and spoke words in his own tongue, a prayer perhaps, or an apology to gods who had already abandoned him once. When he rose, the transformation was complete. The gentle craftsman who had carved toys for children was gone, replaced by someone harder, sharper, like a blade drawn from its sheath after long storage. His movements held a predator's grace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats that only he could truly comprehend. 3 days, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. 3 days to turn fishermen into warriors and children into survivors. He looked back at the village, at the homes that would soon be ash, at the life he had briefly allowed himself to imagine might be possible. Then he shouldered his pack and began walking toward the mountains, leading them all toward an uncertain refuge, while the sea behind them waited patiently for Grimvar's return. The monastery bells had fallen silent 3 days ago. Mira pressed her face against the shutters, watching the orange glow that painted the horizon where St. Aldrich's once stood. Smoke still rose in lazy spirals, carrying the acrid smell of burned timber and something else she didn't want to name. Eric sat motionless in the corner, his weathered hands gripping the wooden doll he'd been carving, the same one he'd worked on since the first screams had echoed across the valley. "They'll come for the village next," her father muttered, pacing behind them. "We should have left when the coastal settlements burned." "And go where?" Mira's mother snapped, though her voice trembled. "Every road leads to more of them." Eric's blade paused against the wood. "Not all of them are the same." The words hung in the air like a confession. Mira turned from the window, studying his face in the dim candlelight. The man who had shared their table for months, who had taught her to whittle and mended their tools with gentle hands, seemed to be wrestling with ghosts only he could see. "What do you mean?" she asked. Before Eric could answer, a horn sounded from the village center. Long, mournful notes that sent ice through Mira's veins. The warning signal. Raiders approaching. Her father grabbed his hunting bow, while her mother began stuffing bread and dried meat into a sack with shaking hands. "The root cellar," she whispered. "We'll hide in the root cellar." But Eric stood slowly, setting down his carving. "No, they'll search every hiding place." He moved to the window, peering through the slats with the practiced eye of someone who understood warfare. "How many families in this village? 50, 60? What does that matter?" Mira's father demanded. "It matters because I know who leads them." Eric's voice carried a weight that made the small room feel colder. "Bjorn Bloodaxe. I recognize his horn call. He burns everything, takes everyone. There's no negotiating with him." The admission settled over them like ash. Mira watched her parents' faces crumple as they realized what Eric hadn't told them. That he could read the signs of his own people's approach like a hunter tracking wolves. "You knew," her mother breathed. "You knew they would come. I hoped they wouldn't find this place." Eric pulled on his cloak, the simple brown wool falling away to reveal the mail shirt he'd kept hidden beneath. "But Bjorn is thorough. He's been hunting me for 2 years." "Hunting you?" Mira stepped closer, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking together. "Why?" Eric's hand went to something beneath his shirt, a pendant or amulet she'd never seen him wear. "Because I carry something that should have died with my clan, something Bjorn believes belongs to him now." The horn sounded again, closer this time, and they could hear the thunder of horses approaching. Shouts echoed between the houses as families scattered like startled birds. Some ran for the forest, others barricaded their doors, but Mira could see through the shutters that it was already too late. Torches moved through the streets like hungry stars. "Take your family and run for the old stone bridge," Eric said, buckling on a sword belt that had appeared from somewhere in his belongings. The blade that slid free wasn't the simple knife of a woodcarver. It was a weapon of war, its steel catching the candlelight like captured lightning. "Follow the stream north until you reach the abandoned mill." "Wait there. What about you?" Mira grabbed his arm, suddenly understanding that everything was about to change. Eric knelt before her, pressing the half-finished wooden doll into her hands. It was a warrior figure, she realized now, carved with intricate knotwork that reminded her of the symbols on ancient stones. "I'm going to give you time to escape. You can't face them alone," her father protested. "I'm not facing them. I'm facing him." Eric stood, and for the first time since she'd known him, Mira saw not the gentle stranger who'd shared their hearth, but the warrior he'd once been. This was always going to happen. I just hoped it would be somewhere else. The door shuddered under heavy blows. Voices shouted in the harsh language Mira had heard Eric murmur in his sleep. Her mother pulled her toward the back entrance, tears streaming down her face. "Eric," Mira called as her parents dragged her away. "Your real name, what is it?" He turned, and in his weathered face she saw something ancient and proud struggling against resignation. "Eric Ironson, last son of the Wolf Clan, guardian of the Bloodstone of Odin." The front door splintered. Torchlight flooded in, followed by armed figures whose mail gleamed like scales. At their head strode a giant of a man with a braided beard and eyes like winter storms. "Hello, cousin?" the giant rumbled in accented but clear English. "I've missed you." As her parents pulled her into the night, Mira heard Eric's reply, spoken in the old tongue but somehow understood. Then let's finish what we started at Stamford Bridge. The dawn brought no peace. Astrid woke to find Bjorn already standing at the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale light. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, and she could see the tension coiled in his shoulders like a hunting cat preparing to strike. "They're close," he said without turning. "I can feel it in my bones." Father emerged from his chamber, fully dressed despite the early hour. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of a sleepless night spent wrestling with impossible choices. "The children from the village. They'll be arriving soon for their lessons." "Cancel them," Bjorn's voice was granite. "Send them away." "I will not." Father's quiet determination surprised Astrid. These children have done nothing wrong. They deserve their chance to learn, regardless of what storms may come. Bjorn finally turned, his ice-blue eyes flashing with frustration. "Your noble principles will get innocent blood spilled, priest. And your warrior's instinct would have us cower in darkness." Father moved to his desk, gathering the precious books they'd been using for lessons. There must be another way. Astrid watched this exchange with growing dread. Both men she'd come to love were right, and both were wrong. The village children shouldn't suffer for harboring a Viking, but neither should they become unwitting shields in a deadly game. "What if we leave?" she asked suddenly. "All of us. We could go to the monastery at Lindisfarne, or—" "Running solves nothing," Bjorn interrupted. "Sven's men would follow. They'd burn this place anyway, and hunt us across the countryside like wolves pursuing wounded deer." The sound of children's laughter drifted through the morning air, and Astrid's heart clenched. Young Willem's distinctive giggle was among them, along with the chatter of at least 6 others. They were coming up the path, carrying their slate boards and precious pieces of chalk, eager for another day of learning to read. "Hide," Father commanded Bjorn urgently. "The loft, quickly." But Bjorn shook his head. "No more hiding. I'm tired of skulking like a coward while good people risk everything for me." He moved toward the door. "I'll meet them in the woods, draw them away." "Stop!" Astrid's voice cut through their argument with unexpected authority. Both men turned to stare at her, and she felt the weight of a decision settling on her young shoulders. "I know what to do." She moved to the wooden chest where Father kept his ceremonial robes and began pulling out the heavy fabric. "Father, you'll continue the lessons as normal. Act as if nothing has changed." "Astrid, what are you—" "Bjorn, you'll stay here, but not hiding." She thrust the dark robes toward him. "You'll be Father's assistant. Pull your hair back, keep your head down, speak only Latin if you must speak at all." Bjorn stared at the priestly garments as if they might bite him. "You want me to pretend to be a monk? You know Latin better than most educated men. You've watched Father teach for days now, and children see what they expect to see, especially when they're focused on their letters." Father's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "It's audacious enough that it might work, but if Sven's men arrive while the children are here, then they see a priest teaching village children, assisted by a visiting brother from another monastery." Astrid's plan crystallized as she spoke. Nothing suspicious, nothing worth investigating closely. The voices outside grew louder. Willem's mother's voice could be heard instructing the children to behave themselves and listen carefully to Father Aldrich. Bjorn still hesitated, the robes hanging from his massive hands like captured shadows. "I've spent my life fighting Christians, not pretending to be one." "You've also spent the last weeks carving toys for Christian children and sharing meals with a Christian priest," Astrid reminded him. "This isn't about betraying who you are, it's about becoming who you need to be to survive." A knock at the door ended their debate. Bjorn moved with surprising speed, pulling the dark robe over his head and gathering his wild hair into a knot at the base of his skull. The transformation was remarkable. The fierce Viking warrior disappeared beneath the humble garments of a man of God. Father opened the door to a chorus of cheerful greetings. 7 children tumbled into the cottage, their faces bright with enthusiasm. Willem immediately spotted the unfamiliar figure and tugged at Father's sleeve. "Who's that, Father Aldrich?" "This is brother—" Benedict, father said smoothly. He's visiting from the monastery at Jarrow, helping me with your education. Bjorn inclined his head solemnly, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched lower, gentler than usual. Pax vobiscum, children. Pax vobiscum, Brother Benedict, they chorused back, clearly impressed by the presence of a real monk from a famous monastery. As father began the day's lesson, Astrid caught Bjorn's eye. For just a moment, she saw something like admiration flash across his features before he bent his head in proper monkish humility. The masquerade had begun, and with it, perhaps their only chance at seeing another sunset. The morning mist clung to the village like a shroud as Astrid crept through the silent streets, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, smoke still rose from the smoldering remains of what had been her home just hours before. The acrid smell of burned thatch and timber filled her nostrils, a bitter reminder of how quickly everything could change. Magnus moved like a shadow beside her, his weathered face grim with purpose. Despite his injuries from the night's battle, he carried himself with the same quiet strength that had first drawn her to trust him in the marketplace months ago. But now she understood what that strength truly meant, what it had cost him, what it would continue to cost them both. "The harbor," he whispered, pointing toward the distant glint of water beyond the houses. "We can find passage north before they realize we've gone." Astrid nodded, though her throat felt tight with unshed tears. Leaving felt like betraying everything she'd ever known, everyone she'd ever loved. Her mother's grave lay in the churchyard they were now fleeing. Her father's memory lingered in every stone of the workshop where he'd taught her to carve wood with patient hands. But staying meant death, not just for her, but for Magnus as well. Lord Grimwald's men would return with the dawn, and this time they wouldn't be content with burning empty buildings. They reached the edge of the village square when Magnus suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her into the shadows of the baker's shop. Through the pre-dawn gloom, she could see figures moving near the well, armed men with the distinctive red cloaks of Grimwald's guard. "Too late," Magnus breathed, his hand moving instinctively to where his sword should have been. He'd lost it in the fire, along with almost everything else that connected him to his warrior past. Astrid felt panic rising in her chest, but then something else took its place, a fierce determination that surprised even her. She thought of her mother's stories about saints who faced down dragons, about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when they had no other choice. "The old mill," she whispered. "There's a way through the grain cellars that leads to the river path. My father showed me once when I was small." Magnus studied her face in the dim light, and she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that she was no longer the frightened child who had offered him bread out of simple kindness. The events of recent weeks had changed them both, forging something stronger than either had been alone. They moved carefully through the maze of storage sheds and animal pens that sprawled behind the main buildings. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every sound might herald discovery. When they finally reached the mill, Astrid's hands shook as she worked the rusted latch that opened the cellar door. The underground passages were older than the mill itself, carved from living rock by hands that had shaped this valley long before Astrid's people arrived. Water dripped steadily from somewhere in the darkness ahead, and the air smelled of earth and secrets. "This way," she whispered, leading Magnus through passages that seemed to remember her father's footsteps, his gentle voice explaining how the mill had been built on ancient foundations, how the past and present were layered together like pages in an illuminated manuscript. They emerged near the riverbank just as the first rays of sunlight touched the opposite hills. The water ran swift and dark, swollen with autumn rains that would carry them away from everything Astrid had ever called home. Magnus was already scanning the scattered boats moored along the muddy shore when Astrid heard voices behind them, harsh commands echoing from the direction they'd come. The guards had found their trail. There, Magnus pointed to a small fishing vessel with a worn sail furled against its mast. "Can you swim if we have to abandon it?" "Well enough," Astrid replied, though the thought of the cold water made her shiver. They splashed through the shallows toward the boat, no longer trying to move quietly. Speed mattered more than stealth now. Magnus hauled himself over the side despite his injuries, then reached down to pull Astrid up after him. The boat rocked dangerously as Magnus struggled with the unfamiliar rigging. He'd told her once that his people were warriors of the sea, but that had been another lifetime. Now he was simply a man trying to save the girl who had saved him first. The current caught them just as shouts erupted from the riverbank. Astrid saw the flash of metal in the growing light, spear points and sword blades raised against the dawn sky, but the river was already carrying them beyond reach, toward whatever lay waiting in the unknown country ahead. She gripped the boat's wooden side and watched her village grow smaller behind them, carrying with her nothing but the clothes she wore, the wooden doll Magnus had carved for her, and a love that had grown stronger than fear. The torches flickered against the stone walls of the monastery as Astrid pressed herself against the cold shadows, her breath coming in short, silent puffs. Through the narrow window, she could see Eric bound to a wooden post in the courtyard, his head hanging forward, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Brother Thomas paced before him like a predator, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by something far more dangerous. "The last of the Iron Wolf clan?" Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. "Do you know how long I've searched for you, Eric Thorson?" Eric raised his head slowly, fixing the monk with a defiant stare despite his bonds. "Long enough to forget your vows, it seems." Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "My vows were always secondary to my true purpose. The church has many servants but few who remember the old debts. Your father's raiders burned my family's village to ash. My sister was 7 years old." Astrid's heart hammered against her ribs. She had followed Eric here after discovering he'd never returned home, tracking his path through the village until old Henrik mentioned seeing him head toward the monastery. Now she understood why Brother Thomas had always seemed so interested in Eric, asking careful questions about his past, his family, his origins. "I was a child when my father died," Eric said, his voice steady despite his circumstances. "I carry no responsibility for his raids. But you carry his blood, and his secrets." Thomas moved closer, pulling a long knife from beneath his robes. "The Iron Wolf treasure wasn't just gold and silver, was it? My sources speak of something far more valuable. Maps to lands beyond the known world, trade routes worth kingdoms." Eric's silence was answer enough. Astrid remembered the leather scroll hidden beneath the loose stone in her family's cottage, the one Eric had entrusted to her safekeeping. Ancient symbols and coastlines drawn in fading ink, his father's final legacy. Thomas pressed the blade against Eric's throat. "Where is it?" "Burned with my clan," Eric lied smoothly. "Lost to your church's crusade." Astrid knew she had to act. Her father was away trading in the next village, her mother tending to a difficult birth at the miller's house. No one knew where she was, and by morning it might be too late. She slipped away from the window, her mind racing through possibilities. The monastery's kitchen door was always unlocked. Brother Francis often rose before dawn to begin baking. Astrid crept through the familiar corridors, past the scriptorium where she had sometimes helped copy texts, past the chapel where she had knelt through countless services. Everything looked different now, shadows seeming to hide watchers, familiar spaces transformed into a trap. She found what she needed in Brother Francis's workshop, a small barrel of the strong spirits he used for cleaning wounds and preserving herbs. Working quickly, she soaked several rags in the liquid, then gathered an armful of the dried rushes used for floor covering. The plan was desperate, perhaps foolish, but it was all she had. Back in the courtyard, Thomas had grown impatient. "Perhaps pain will refresh your memory." He heated the knife blade over a torch flame. "Start with your fingers. Vikings value their sword hands, don't they?" "Wait!" Astrid called out, stepping into the circle of torchlight with her arms full of makeshift materials. "I know where it is." Both men turned toward her, Eric's face going pale with horror. "Astrid, no, run." Thomas smiled, lowering the heated blade. The little village mouse, how convenient. His eyes narrowed as he studied her burden. "What game are you playing, child?" "No game," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have what you want. But first, let him go." "I think not." Tell me where—" Astrid struck flint to steel, the spark catching the spirit-soaked cloth instantly. Flames leaped up her arm as she hurled the burning mass at the nearest pile of rushes. "Let him go, or watch your monastery burn!" The dry material caught immediately, fire racing across the courtyard stones. Thomas cursed, lunging toward her, but Astrid was already moving, throwing another burning bundle toward the wooden scaffolding against the chapel wall. "Astrid!" Eric strained against his bonds as flames began to lick at the post that held him. She reached him just as Thomas recovered from his shock, drawing a knife from her belt to saw at the ropes. The monk advanced on them through the growing smoke, but shouts were already rising from the monastery, as other brothers woke to the smell of fire. The bonds parted just as Thomas reached them. Eric swept Astrid behind him, weaponless but still dangerous even with his injuries. The two men circled each other, while flames danced higher around them, casting wild shadows on the ancient stones. "This ends tonight," Thomas snarled, raising his blade. But Eric smiled grimly, and Astrid realized he was no longer the broken man who had carved dolls for bread. He was once again a warrior. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as Astrid watched Magnus carefully wrap his few belongings in the leather satchel that had become his only constant companion. His movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as he placed the small wooden bear, the first doll she had seen him carve, alongside the ancient clan medallion that had nearly cost them everything. "You don't have to go," she said quietly, though they had argued this point through the night. "Father says you're welcome to stay." The village council agreed. Magnus's weathered hands paused over the satchel's leather ties. "Your father is a good man, Astrid. Better than most would be to a stranger who brought danger to their door." He straightened, his pale eyes meeting hers with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "But I have carried death in my shadow for too long. It's time I faced what remains of my past alone." Through the window, Astrid could see villagers beginning their daily routines. Old Henrik was already at his forge, the rhythmic hammering of familiar comfort. Children played in the square where just 3 days ago, blood had been spilled as Magnus fought off the last of his clan's enemies, men who had tracked him across half the known world for the secret he carried. "The location of the treasure," Astrid said, giving voice to what had driven those men to such lengths. "You could have told them. Saved us all the trouble." Magnus's laugh held no humor. "There never was any treasure, child. Not gold or silver, anyway." He touched the medallion through the leather. What they wanted was knowledge, the location of sacred sites, burial grounds, places where the old ways still held power. Men like Bjorn would have used that knowledge to plunder and desecrate everything my people held sacred. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Astrid's father entered, his face bearing the careful neutrality he wore when delivering difficult news. Behind him came Brother Thomas, the traveling monk who had arrived the previous evening. "The roads are clear," her father announced. "Brother Thomas leaves for the monastery this morning. He's agreed to travel with you as far as the crossroads." The monk nodded, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "I would welcome the company. These are uncertain times for lone travelers." Magnus shouldered his satchel and turned to face them. 3 months ago, Astrid thought, she had encountered a broken man reduced to trading crude wooden toys for scraps of bread. The man who stood before her now carried himself differently. Still scarred by loss, still bearing the weight of being the last of his kind, but no longer defeated. "Before you go," she said, reaching into her apron. She withdrew the small wooden horse he had carved for her, the one that had started their unlikely friendship. "I want you to have this back." "Astrid, no." Magnus's voice was gentle but firm. "I made that for you. It belongs here, with someone who understands that the value of a thing isn't in its price, but in the care with which it's made." She pressed it back into her apron, tears threatening. "Will we ever see you again?" Magnus was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the village that had become, however briefly, something resembling home. "Perhaps, when the seasons turn and the old wounds have healed. When I found a place where the last stories of my people can be preserved properly." He smiled then, and for the first time since she had known him, it reached his eyes. "I promise you this, I will continue carving, and every piece will carry a little of what I learned here about kindness from strangers." They walked together to the village edge, where the road forked toward distant lands. Other villagers had gathered, not all, for there were still those who viewed Magnus with suspicion, but enough to constitute a proper farewell. Even young Willem was there, his arms still bound from the recent fighting, offering a respectful nod to the warrior who had saved his life. As Magnus and brother Thomas prepared to depart, the monk turned back to address Astrid's father. "You've raised a remarkable daughter. Her compassion may have saved more than one man's life these past months." When the two figures had dwindled to distant specks on the horizon, Astrid remained at the roadside long after the others had returned to their daily tasks. The wooden horse seemed to weigh heavier in her pocket, a tangible reminder that courage sometimes wore the face of simple kindness. Her father's hand settled on her shoulder. "Come, there's work to be done, and winter won't wait for our melancholy." As they walked back toward the village, Astrid carried with her the knowledge that some bonds transcend the boundaries of clan and culture, that mercy extended to strangers might echo across generations, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with nothing more than offering bread to someone who hungers.